It was one of the most ghoulish episodes of the 19th century. Bands of criminals breaking into graves in the dead of night to steal freshly buried bodies. It was fueled by a revolution in medicine that was desperate for corpses to dissect.
It was a trade, and these surgeon anatomists, they needed bodies for teaching students, and so therefore they would put in these orders and requests.
But grave robbers weren't the only ones snatching bodies. New evidence reveals a secret trade in corpses organised by the wealthiest and most powerful in Victorian society.
We found over 450 portions of people who'd been sawn up into parts, and also more than 7,500 single bits of bone.
A trade that went on for a century, exploiting society's poorest and most vulnerable, all of it enshrined in law. So before, dissection was a punishment for murderers. Now, dissection's a punishment for the poor.
The poor are now the new target.
The hunt for evidence will take us into the boneyard of a prominent Oxford hospital, and I'll be uncovering how one man turned the body trade into an industry.
In the dead carriage, it looked like it was market garden produce packed in boxes, but of course it wasn't. It was actually bodies.
And revealing the human cost of this grisly business.
So when Louisa Mixer thought her mother was going into the grave, she was actually following a box of other body parts that Guy's Hospital had already sent back for recycling.
It's a tale that reveals how modern medicine was built on the exploitation of the poor, the unfortunate, and the friendless. In 1901, the year of Queen Victoria's state funeral, another burial took place in a small cemetery in Norfolk. The service was for a man called Frank Hyde. But a month later, a newspaper made an extraordinary claim, that Hyde's grave was empty. They were right, there was no body. But Hyde's corpse wasn't missing, it had never been buried. The ceremony at the cemetery was all an elaborate hoax. Instead, the body had been sold secretly to a medical school in Cambridge. Frank Hyde was a labourer who'd ended up in the Yarmouth workhouse after falling on hard times. When he died, aged just 50, the workhouse traded his body for just £75 in today's money. Then they staged a false funeral, complete with a coffin full of sawdust, forged the papers, and sent poor Hyde off in a death box on the train to Cambridge, where he ended up being dissected by medical students. The story of Frank Hyde is far from a one-off. It was just one example of a hidden trade in the bodies of the poor that had been going on for over 100 years. To find out why means going back to the beginnings of modern medicine. Body parts like these have been locked away in teaching hospitals and museums for many years. They're dissected human remains, which have played an important role in our understanding of medical science. But who were these people? And how did their bodies end up under the anatomist's knife? In many cases, the answer's a shocking Victorian scandal. Evidence is emerging that the great medical advances of the 19th century were built on a dark secret: the exploitation of the poor by the very institutions set up to help them. The Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel was founded by a group of philanthropists in 1740 to provide free treatment for the sick poor of the East End. In 2006, archaeologists stumbled upon a forgotten cemetery in the grounds containing the remains of patients from the 19th century. Back then, only the poorest in society ended up in hospital. The wealthy were treated in their own homes. Bone specialist Jackie McKinley has joined Natasha Powers to find out what the cemetery revealed.
We found over 450 portions of people who'd been sawn up into parts, and also more than 7,500 disarticulated single bits of bone.
So it was quite obvious at a certain stage that you didn't have exactly a normal cemetery.
Yes, we knew we had something really special and unusual.
There were remains from 500 people in all, but while some bore the signs of a standard autopsy to discover cause of death, the majority had been dismembered to such an extent there had to be another explanation.
If they only had a craniotomy, so a cut through the skull, and a thoracic cut of some kind, so somewhere through the chest.
So they've been looking at the heart region, that kind of thing?
Exactly. Then we said that that was an autopsy. If they had other cuts, for example, if you look here...
Oh, right, and this is the bottom end of the spine, so you're looking at this area here.
That's been sawn straight through the middle into 2 pieces.
Yeah, it's a very clean cut, isn't it?
And you wouldn't do that normally as part of an autopsy. And we found lots of portions of people that are cut up in this way. All of this tells us that we're looking at a sample of dissected remains that have been part of a teaching process. People are learning how to carry out operations, amputations and surgery, and they're also learning anatomy from these remains.
The state of the remains could only mean one thing: that the surgeon in charge of anatomy, Sir William Blizzard, let his trainee doctors routinely cut up or dissect the hospital's dead for learning purposes. The problem was that this was illegal, because ever since the mid-18th century, the only legal source of bodies for dissection was hanged murderers.
So they were basically breaking the law?
Yes. The documentary records tell us that it was accepted practice within the hospital that this is what you did, and that the reasons for doing it were because it was so much better to practice on the dead than mess up on the living.
And there was another equally disturbing finding.
When we look at which bones we've actually got in the graves, we seem to have too few heads, as in skulls and mandibles and necks. Right. And we don't really know why this is, but it's quite probable that this may mean that some heads are being maybe handed on or possibly even sold on to other hospitals or possibly even dentists.
The secret of what the Royal London was doing to the poor patients in its care did leak out, as an extraordinary pamphlet circulated in 1825 reveals. It was written by a woman called Anne Millard, and she wanted to expose the hospitals. And one of the hospitals that she talks about is the Royal London Hospital. She says, the London Hospital is entirely supplied by subjects which have been their own patients. During the winter, the professors of the London Hospital keep all who die under their care for home consumption. Anne's protests made no difference. The dating of the hospital's dissected remains revealed that dissection of its patients continued. The Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford was another of the free hospitals for the poor that was springing up in the 18th century. Plans to develop the old burial grounds have given archaeologists the chance to find out whether it too was using dead patients for medical students to practice on. The Radcliffe's head of anatomy from 1822 was Professor John Kidd. Was he too overseeing these illegal practices? If there's evidence of routine dissection even here in provincial Oxford, it could mean that law-breaking by doctors was far more widespread than previously thought. Jackie McKinley has joined the excavation's director, Dan Poor.
This is just absolutely fantastic. It looks like a piece of installation art. I mean, this is a whole mass of disarticulated bones, sort of all jumbled up. I mean, you've got parts of the forearm bone there, and there's elbow joints here and here, shoulders and hip and skull. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But it's all stuck in this concrete. What's all that about?
Well, basically what's happened is an earlier pit has been dug and it's been filled with loose human bone. And then a later trench has been dug along the line, right through the middle of that loose pit full of bone, for the purposes of putting a new concrete foundation in.
Trying to distinguish dissected body parts from the jumble of limbs amputated surgically will be difficult enough. And evidence of reburials only muddies the waters further.
It looks like what we would probably call a charnel pit, where they've disturbed burials, early burials, by recutting of graves, and they've gathered together those bones, and rather than just throwing them on the surface, they've put them carefully into this pit here. Did we find anything?
We did have a single craniotomy,
Right.
but it's perfectly possible that that was from an earlier burial.
Yeah.
It was disturbed, but we will examine it very closely, as we will with all the disturbed graves, for evidence of the anatomization or the dissection that might be present.
So we still can't be sure what the Radcliffe dig will reveal. But why were the hospitals breaking the law by dissecting their dead patients? The early 18th century was a time of intellectual turmoil, the age of enlightenment. Rational thought and scientific ideas started to challenge religious belief as the only way to understand the natural world. It ushered in a new medicine that was focused on understanding the mechanics of the human body.
The old system of medical education, which was essentially pretty static, pretty stagnant, that gets swept away in the revolution, and it's replaced by a model of medical education that is in every way modern. So if you want to understand how the human body can be different in different people, you need to open up a whole lot of bodies and see what's going on inside them.
These models are astonishingly accurate. But for a trainee doctor, there was no better way to learn anatomy than by cutting up a real cadaver.
So by, let's say, the middle of the 18th century, dissection, the use of models like this in mainstream medical education is perfectly standard.
And that's when the desire for more cadavers from the medical schools really mushrooms.
There's a huge demand for bodies for medical schools. Dissection is becoming this important tool of medical education. You can't call yourself a doctor unless you've dissected. So by that point, there really is a huge demand for bodies from all kinds of places.
Although dissection wasn't yet compulsory training, it was the best way for students to learn anatomy, improve their skills and save lives. But people didn't want their own corpse sliced and diced. According to the Christian beliefs of the time, mutilating the body could prevent the soul's ultimate resurrection. The spirit would be left as a wandering ghost, unable to ever rest in peace. And there's no doubt 18th century dissection was pretty unpleasant, as Alex Langlands is about to discover with the help of surgeon Vishy Mahadevan and an anatomical specimen. Luckily, this one's still breathing.
Now, our body here, obviously it's decomposing, it's a race against time, so where would you start?
The first instrument would be this, the surgeon's friend, or the anatomist's friend, a scalpel.
Okay.
I would begin by making a generous vertical cut through the full thickness of the abdominal wall, starting just below the breastbone.
And as you make that cut, I'm assuming that would unleash a lot of odour as well.
In fact, once I've gone through the abdominal wall, all the intestines would bulge out through the cut.
In the absence of any circulation, all those internal organs are beginning to decompose by a process that we call putrefaction. It's one unsightly, smelly, unholy mess.
Dissection was far more invasive than a modern post-mortem. Medical students would remove all the internal organs, including the brain, and dismember the body into 25 pieces. It was a highly controversial practice. Doctors stood accused of reducing the human body to a pile of meat and offal.
And of course, by the time the anatomist had finished dissecting the four limbs and the head and neck, there wouldn't have been very much left to bury.
A little small bag of leftovers, basically.
Indeed, yes.
That's a pretty grim old business.
It was a very grim business indeed.
Few objected to the legally sanctioned dissection of hanged murderers, gruesomely depicted in this Hogarth engraving from 1751. It was seen as an extra punishment, just desserts for the very worst sinners. But by 1800, the gallows only delivered 15 corpses a year in the whole country. Not enough for surgeons to practice on, and not enough to satisfy the need for anatomical knowledge. The new medicine faced an impasse. The solution was to turn to the criminal underworld itself. The trade in stolen corpses was about to take off. It's a week into the dig at the old burial ground at Oxford's Radcliffe Hospital. Archaeologists are looking for any evidence that doctors here might have broken the law by letting students dissect the bodies of their poor patients. What's certain is that by the early 1800s, the new medical schools were facing a crisis. A huge jump in the number of apprentice doctors and not enough dead bodies to train them on. The only legal source, executed murderers, couldn't keep pace with demand. A new and grisly trade sprang up to supply the anatomist's slab. This is the part of the story we all know about, isn't it? Ghoulish tales of grave robbers, body snatchers, or resurrection men as they were known, operating in gangs, sneaking into cemeteries at the dead of night, stealing freshly buried bodies for medical schools. And for a lot of people, it would have been worth it, because one body could be worth a month's wages. London, with its 12 anatomy schools, was the grave robber's most lucrative market. Many a body ended up in the back rooms of pubs like this on their way to the anatomist's slab. Jelena Beckvelets from the Museum of London has brought along a secret diary dating from 1811, later discovered and published by a historian. Written by body snatcher Joshua Naples, it gives a chilling insight into the scale of this ghoulish trade. So it says, at 12 midnight, a party went to Wygate. This is just like a movie, isn't it? Got 3 small. What's small mean?
Well, small, if you were a subject, that's what the body would be known as. You were either a small or a large, and a small would be generally a child. And if you're less than 3 foot in length, you're measured per inch.
Each man's share, £8.16 and 8 pence. That sounds quite a lot of money.
It is. That was a lot of money then, and in today's, it's probably valued about sort of £350 to £500.
Wow, each man's share for a night's work.
Yeah. So it could be collectively over a longer period of time, but the amount of money that they were making doing this trade was a lot more than you would be doing in any other sort of trades at this time.
Over here it says, Butler and Dan took one large to Frampton, a large and a small to Hornig. What would Frampton and Hornig be?
They're names of surgeon anatomists, so it's very interesting that they're actually he's giving the names of people who are actually requesting to have bodies supplied to them, so you're getting the names of the surgeon anatomists themselves.
So he's actually responding to an order?
Yes. Yeah.
This isn't random?
No, it's not random at all. They sort of saw themselves as professional, it was a trade, and these surgeon anatomists, they needed bodies for teaching students, and so therefore they would put in these orders and requests.
Do you fancy any pork scratchings?
Yeah, go on then, that sounds good.
By 1831, there were over 900 students studying anatomy in London, but the number of legally available bodies numbered only 11. It's no wonder that grave robbing was such big business. Alex Langlands is finding out from Druin Birch how grave robbers avoided detection and uncovering some surprising loopholes in 19th century law.
First of all, you take some care to make sure that you leave no trace. So you look at what's around the grave. There might be some flowers or some stones or some other trinkets there, and you note where they are so you can put them back afterwards. It doesn't look like anyone's been doing anything dodgy through the night.
Okay. And actually, what about actually getting down? I mean, sometimes these things are buried, what, we say 6 feet under, don't we?
Yeah, we do. But you want to spend as little time digging as possible. So it wouldn't be a case of doing in reverse what the grave digger had done. You wouldn't be taking 6 foot of soil off and bringing the coffin up whole.
grave robbers had just a few days after burial to ensure a fresh corpse. The easiest way to extract it was to dig a hole at the head end of the grave. They'd then crowbar off the coffin lid, snapping it against the weight of the earth on top, using sacking to muffle the noise. With a noose or hook, they'd snag the body and yank it out of the hole. Taking any personal possessions from the coffin was a no-no, because incredible as it sounds, that would risk a worse punishment than the theft of a corpse.
The body couldn't legally be property, so you couldn't be done for a felony for stealing the body. You couldn't steal it, it didn't belong to anyone.
Yeah.
But anything that had been on the body, rings, jewellery, the shroud, clothes, you took that and you could be hung for theft, you could be transported to Australia. So they had to be very, very careful to take all of that off, put it back in the grave, and then just be left with the corpse, shove it over their shoulder, move it to the hospital in the morning.
Grisly stories of loved ones dragged from their graves, stripped and spirited away to be dismembered, spooked the nation. This graveyard in Edinburgh is close to the city's famous medical school, which by 1825 was training 900 doctors a year. Evidence of the fear of body snatchers is everywhere. Anyone who could afford it turned the graves of their loved ones into fortresses. Watchtowers were erected to protect the dead from the living. The precautions worked, but they pushed the price of cadavers even higher. The serious profits involved led some ruthless opportunists to a new and infamous extreme.
This is the death mask of Irish labourer William Burke, taken from his head after he was hanged in 1829. Here in Edinburgh, he and William Hare, this is Hare here, dug themselves a place in criminal history by taking body snatching to a whole new level. They were charged with murdering 16 people in order to sell their corpses to the surgeons.
In a fitting end to Burke's murderous career, his body was given to Edinburgh's medical school and dissected. His case and a spate of copycat murders were the last straw. At last, Parliament decided to act to halt the illicit trade in bodies.
In the year 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed to do away with body snatching and burking once and for all. But what the legislators replaced it with was equally sinister: the full-scale trade in the bodies of the poor, sanctioned by the state.
At the Radcliffe Infirmary dig in Oxford, archaeologists are exploring old burial grounds containing the remains of patients. There's no evidence that doctors here took part in the grave robbing trade, but were they illegally dissecting the bodies of their dead patients? The smoking gun would be human remains dismembered without any clear clinical purpose.
Oh, Helen, this looks seriously, seriously unpleasant.
It certainly does. That's a pretty nasty case of osteomyelitis, actually. This is the tibia, which is the shin bone.
Here we've got a normal one, so we can see what it should look like.
Exactly. So you can see it's very grossly deformed. It's huge compared to that one. It's got these big holes in it, which is where the pus would have extruded. We've also got the end of the thigh bone, the femur, which articulates with it. And if you have a look there, you can see that it's actually been cut off.
Yeah, it's clean cut, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's actually an amputated limb.
It's clear that this poor devil's diseased leg was surgically amputated, rather than being dissected after his death.
But you've got something quite different here, which suggests...
But another find looks more suspicious.
We've got these fragments of skull, which have clearly been cut through. You can see that they've been cleanly cut across the top of the skull, down the middle and around the side as well. Right. So this perhaps looks like some kind of intervention where they wanted to properly have a look inside the skull.
I don't understand why they would need to do that if you're just doing an autopsy.
Medical.
And the other interesting thing is these little marks that you can see here, which I'd refer to as filleting marks.
Similar to what you'd see on animal bone that's been butchered,
Yeah,
trying to clean the...
exactly. Intriguing.
Further analysis will be needed to establish whether the cut marks on the skull are the result of a routine autopsy or evidence of illegal dissections by the hospital. Back in the 1830s, it wasn't the dissection of hospital patients that was hitting the headlines. Instead, it was the spate of grave robbing and murder that caused public outrage. Parliament finally responded by passing the 1832 Anatomy Act, which solved the body shortage by providing a new legal source of corpses.
So this is it. This is the Anatomy Act of 1832. Probably the most significant document that we'll ever see about our human bodies. What was it trying to do? What was its objective?
It was trying to keep the supply of bodies to the anatomists. And you've lost the natural supply from body snatching, so we've got to find a new source.
So who was it that they were going to target?
Well, let's have a look at the Act and see what it says. And be it enacted that it should be lawful for any executor or other party having lawful possession of the body of any deceased person to permit the body of said diseased person to undergo anatomical examination. Everybody who read it knew that the people who were to be executors, the key people, were the administrators of workhouses and of hospitals, who would make sure that the bodies of the poor were taken in this process to the anatomist's table.
So this is specifically targeting the poor?
Very much so, but you wouldn't know it if you just read the Act.
So before, dissection was a punishment for murderers. Now, dissection's a punishment for the poor.
The poor are now the new target.
The new Act meant that many institutions supposedly set up to look after the poor could now sell their bodies to medical schools, and the safeguards were paper thin.
But didn't poor people have the right to say, excuse me, I don't want to be dissected, I want something else to happen to me when I die?
Yes, if they could get a written document that said they didn't want to be dissected, or if they could get 2 witnesses, or if they could get one of their relatives to make sure that they said he didn't want to be, then they would avoid this. Unfortunately, they were mainly illiterate, their relatives often never knew, there was no register that enabled them to say before they died that they didn't want this.
So however elegant and objective the phraseology of this Act might sound, it's all piffle, it's whitewash.
It never said you can't trade in these bodies. It never says you can't take money for them, which means that a new trade in pauper cadavers, in the cadavers of the poor, was created in precisely the atmosphere where you're not supposed to be trading anymore.
It's funny, even though all of this happened the best part of 200 years ago, you still sound outraged.
I am outraged, really, because in many ways it seems that the anatomists believed that the bodies of the poor were their right. This was a natural source. The poor didn't believe that. The poor didn't have a vote. Parliament then decided, through this Act, that they would make sure the anatomists got the bodies of the poor. And that makes me angry.
The Anatomy Act solved the shortage of corpses at a stroke by cynically legalising what was already happening in teaching hospitals like the Royal London. Analysis of the remains of 259 patients there reveals that after the new law, the routine dissection of patients for medical training simply continued, and medical schools were about to get a plentiful new source of bodies to dissect.
In 1834, 2 years after the Anatomy Act was passed, the government passed the Poor Law, which said that from now on, if you were poor and you wanted assistance, you had to go to the workhouse. No more begging, no more tramps traipsing round the country. This meant that the number of workhouses and the number of poor people going to them rocketed.
Workhouses gave the poor food and shelter in exchange for manual labour, but their notoriously harsh regime led them to being dubbed prisons of the poor. The jump in the number of people forced to enter the workhouse had another sinister consequence. If you died there and your family failed to legally claim your body, it became workhouse property to be sold to the highest bidder.
The year the Anatomy Act was passed, one of its chief critics, Lord Tenham, warned that it would convert every workhouse keeper into a systematic trafficker of dead bodies. Although it would be another 25 years before the public realised just how right he was.
In 1857, a trial at the Old Bailey tore the lid off the corrupt trade in the bodies of the poor. The case was brought against Alfred Feist, the master of a London workhouse, by a woman called Louise Mixer. Louise's mother, Mary Whitehead, had died in the workhouse. Louise would later make a statement to the police.
I went into the dead house. I saw Mr. Feist. He asked me who I came to see and I told him, Mary Whitehead. The undertaker was with him in the dead house. One of them took the lid off the coffin and I saw my mother in the coffin. After looking at her, Mr. Feist told me to go back into the waiting room. We did, and Mr. Feist came there and told us to follow what was supposed to be the remains of my mother.
Why was supposed to be the remains of her mother?
Well, let's look at this warrant. He agreed to have Mary Whitehead sent to Guy's Hospital in the anatomy school.
So this poor woman goes to see her mum in the coffin. The undertaker and the guy from the workhouse lift up the coffin lid and show the body. Then she goes to the funeral, except it's not her mum in the coffin anymore.
That's exactly right. And when we go to the statement of the undertaker, he admits that this is a fairly regular process.
Guy's Hospital even recycled the dissected remains of corpses, sending them back to stand in for stolen bodies like that of Louise's mother.
So when it says the remains from other bodies, that just means bits and pieces that the hospital had lying around?
Well, oftentimes that's what anatomical education required. Whatever pieces they had left of bodies, including larger portions, would be loaded into a coffin to replicate typical body weights. And those would be substituted for the bodies at the workhouse. So when Louisa Mixer thought her mother was going into the grave, she was actually following a box of other body parts that Guy's Hospital had already sent back for recycling.
Sort of seconds, things they didn't need anymore.
Exactly.
Did they always stuff these coffins with other bodies?
No, oftentimes to make weight, workhouses and undertakers would substitute things like bricks or sand or whatever made the coffin feel substantial enough that you would believe your loved one was going into the ground.
Alfred Feist had turned the workhouse mortuary into a highly profitable conveyor belt, exchanging the bodies of the workhouse poor for hard cash.
That's so horrible and so cynical. Presumably, Feist was found guilty.
Well, he was found guilty by the trial court, but on appeal, he was set free because the charge against him was selling bodies under the Anatomy Act. In fact, it wasn't a crime to sell bodies under the Anatomy Act, and since he had rightful control of the body, where nobody else had claimed it, he was able to respond to the investigator's warrant.
But she had claimed the body.
Well, she hadn't specifically claimed it. She came to attend a funeral, but she did not offer to take the body herself and have the body buried.
That's terrible, isn't it?
Well, and the workhouse people would not tell her that that was her right either.
Yeah.
So if she had the ability, she was not informed that she could do so.
But Louise Mixer believed she had claimed her mother's body and seen it safely buried. Instead, the funeral was a sham. The case did cause public outrage. It exposed the poor's lack of rights over their own bodies. Influential figures spoke out. Charles Dickens said that the government lacked the willpower to end the trade because it was the poor who were dissected, not the middle class and the rich. And a few at the top of society were waking up to this moral injustice. Despite the rising number of dissections in the nation's medical schools, it seems the Radcliffe Infirmary wasn't part of this trend. After 2 weeks digging in Oxford, archaeologists found no evidence that its doctors dissected their dead patients, even after the Anatomy Act made it standard practice. The mystery was solved by a fascinating document discovered in the archives, the minutes from one meeting in June 1839.
If you just look at this paragraph just here. Oh, right. Whilst this court is favourable to scientific inquiries of this sort, it forbids the dissection of any patient in the infirmary for the sake of mere anatomical demonstration.
Exactly.
So they were quite unequivocal about the fact they did not want this to be going on. Why is this? Why did they have this attitude?
Well, the Board of Governors at the Radcliffe mostly comprised quite influential clergymen, and they were first and foremost protectors of the poor. So that included preserving their dignity in death as well, which is why they are quite against anatomisation purely for the sake of anatomisation. And they actually repeat this clause throughout the book as you go through.
Years after the law on dissection was relaxed, the Radcliffe Infirmary remained opposed. So Head of Anatomy John Kidd had to send his students to London to get their hands on a corpse. But it's hard to know whether the hospital's stance was one of genuine respect for the poor, or whether it contained a dash of self-preservation. Because in the 1830s, public anger over the exploitation of the bodies of the poor had erupted onto the streets of several cities. In Cambridge, a mob stormed the anatomy theatre, halting a dissection. Even a handful of workhouses turned their backs on the corpse trade. Medical schools again faced a shortage of bodies. But as the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain, anatomists were able to cast their net more widely. The body trade was about to become seriously big business. The 1832 Anatomy Act had introduced a system that allowed hospitals and workhouses to trade in the bodies of the poor. But a public backlash meant the supply of bodies was once again under threat. When medicine became a regulated profession in 1858, formal anatomy education and dissection were compulsory for all trainee doctors. Such was the demand from the medical schools for cadavers that the trade in the local dead poor couldn't satisfy the need. The solution was to scour the country for corpses. The body business was going national. In Cambridge, historian Elizabeth Hurren has uncovered how one anatomist turned the city into the UK's cadaver capital.
So this is the man.
In 1883, the city's medical school took on a new head of anatomy, Professor Alexander McAllister. Talented and ambitious, McAllister was determined that the shortage of bodies shouldn't stand in the way of teaching anatomy.
It says here we propose 56 heads, 40 arms, 32 legs, 32... Abdomens.
Yes.
So, these three lines here, is that three lots of students?
Yes, it is. So what he's doing is he needs to divide up that human material in order to make sure that they've done every body part to qualify in medicine.
So these new reforms are going to require a lot of bodies. Are there enough bodies in Cambridge?
No, there are never enough. All medical schools preferred to buy locally in the vicinity. It was a doorstep business. But in their era, the number of medical students is going up so much they have to go to the industrial heartlands, in the Midlands, in the places where, unfortunately, public health is very poor.
To get the bodies he needed, McAllister took advantage of the changes sweeping through Britain. The poor had flocked to find work in the newly industrialised cities, and many ended up in the workhouse. And Elizabeth discovered that many of the towns from which McAllister sourced his bodies had one thing in common.
Why is it that places like Mildenhall, for example, or Hitchin, coming into Cambridge here, why is it that they're supplying a disproportionate amount of bodies? Because actually they're very small towns in this period. And that's when I had a eureka moment, which is that the railway is absolutely pivotal to his body business. He's getting on and off all of the branch lines and all the fast train routes that feed into Cambridge, and it's those that he's targeting. And he's getting on and off the train, and he's doing the personal deals.
How could he transport them? Presumably he couldn't just prop them up in the seats.
No, he could not. They were in a rear carriage, which was known as the dead carriage. And in the dead carriage, it looked like it was market garden produce packed in boxes, but of course it wasn't. It was actually bodies packed in a double, what was known as a double deal box.
Presumably he needed to get the bodies quickly into Cambridge because otherwise they would go off.
Absolutely, and preservation techniques are very crude, so the fresher, the faster, the better into Cambridge. That was his motto.
Other medical schools followed McAllister's lead, all jostling for a stake in the booming body trade. The expanding railway network helped them source more bodies from further and further afield. Elizabeth has discovered that Cambridge alone sourced nearly 3,000 bodies, while schools in London got through 60,000. It's estimated that in the first 100 years after the passing of the Anatomy Act, 99% of all bodies used in medical schools had been taken from asylums and workhouses and hospitals. It was certainly the case that the burden of medical research had been borne by the poorest in Victorian society. Elizabeth's latest research reveals the jaw-dropping scale of the Victorian body trade. According to her calculations, over a 100-year period, an astonishing 125,000 bodies were traded nationwide. Some 3,000 of the bodies dissected at Cambridge Medical School were buried here at Mill Road Cemetery, all in unmarked graves. These nameless dead bear witness to the exploitation of the poor and powerless by the most wealthy and educated in Victorian society. The Anatomy Act remained in force for more than 150 years, only being repealed in 1984. But the issue of consent over dissection remained a grey area and caused a new public uproar. As recently as 2001, NHS helplines were deluged with calls from anxious parents after the shocking news broke that hospitals across England were storing 100,000 organs. It emerged that doctors had stockpiled the body parts of thousands of people for research. Most of them were from children, but without consent.
Alder Hay this afternoon apologised to relatives.
It became known as the Alder Hay scandal, and revelations from the public inquiry were grotesque and distressing.
In addition to over 2,000 children's hearts, there are a large number of brain parts, eyes taken from fetuses, over 1,500 stillbirths of fetuses, and perhaps most disturbingly of all, a number of children's heads and bodies.
In 2004, Parliament passed the Human Tissue Act. It closed the last loopholes in the law and spelt out the rights that everyone has over his or her body, even after death. It's impossible to quantify the role that the Victorian body trade played in advancing anatomical knowledge, but there's no doubt that it made a huge contribution to creating modern medicine.
It enables the growth of mass medical education. As society industrialises, as we get population increase in this country, we need large numbers of highly skilled, well-qualified doctors. These doctors need to learn their skills in some ways, and it's the Victorian trade in bodies that enables this kind of close, practical contact with the dead, learning the fine-level structure of the body and putting that into practice in new ways.
Nowadays, more than 1,000 people a year willingly donate their bodies for students to dissect. And thanks to some 21st century technology, the demand could fall.
Hi there.
Hiya.
How are you doing?
All right, is this Melanie?
This is Melanie, yeah. So
I've always wanted to meet her. What is she exactly?
she is a collection of CT scans created to help us teach students anatomy.
This is a virtual body, the first of its kind in Europe. It costs £60,000 and it might just be the future of anatomical teaching.
What do we do if we want to get rid of all the skin and the flesh and stuff?
So we can do that by clicking on the eye and pressing this button, and that strips away all of that flesh that we were seeing and just leaves us with a picture of her vascular anatomy.
I suppose what it can't give you is that tactile, experiential feeling of dealing with a body.
No, and I think there's a real argument for maintaining some of the older style methods of teaching anatomy, because you're right. When you're doing dissection, you learn about tissue handling, and it gives you learn respect as well for the human body. So I think, in my view, this is an exceptionally good adjunct to teaching anatomy, but I think it's not a replacement for the slightly older-fashioned ways that we go about teaching it.
Medicine continues to pose ethical dilemmas. Just how far are we willing to go for scientific knowledge, and who pays the price?
It's inconceivable that the body trade of Victorian Britain would be tolerated today. But one fact is indisputable. The medical knowledge we now depend on to save lives was often learnt and developed on stolen bodies. And that's a sacrifice we shouldn't forget.
Unlocking the secrets of how Iron Age Britons first took to sea to discover the outside world. Another Time Team special, The Boats That Made Britain, at the same time next week. Next tonight, a credit crunch comedy caper. Can a group of workers steal back the money a Wall Street businessman swindled them out of in Tower Heist?